Imagine standing on Newport's cliff walk, the Atlantic crashing below, and towering above you are palaces built not for kings, but for America's wealthiest families. Some glitter with restored marble halls and chandeliers, while others sit in silence, shuttered, ruined, or swallowed by weeds. These walls once held the laughter of Vanderbilts, the whispers of scandals, and in some cases, the echoes people swear never left. Over the next couple of hours, we'll wander through these mansions, those still standing proud, and those the world has almost forgotten, piecing together the rise, fall, and strange afterlives of Newport's gilded treasures. If you enjoy long documentaries like this, hit subscribe and give this video a like. It really helps me make more of them. And while you're watching, drop a comment below. Tell me where you are in the world right now, what time it is, and if you feel like it, share which part of Newport's past you find most fascinating. Foundations of opulence. Newport before the Gilded Age. Before Newport became a byword for gilded splendor, before its cliffs were lined with marble palaces and French-inspired chateaux, it was just a modest coastal town perched on the southern tip of Rhode Island. For much of the 18th and early 19th centuries, Newport's reputation had very little to do with glittering mansions. It was a town of whalers, fishermen, and merchants, whose economy rose and fell with the tides of the Atlantic. Ships left its harbor carrying rum and molasses, and during the colonial period, it was even a hub of the triangular trade. But like the sea that defined it, Newport's fortunes were unpredictable. By the early 1800s, Newport was nearly forgotten compared to Boston or New York. Its golden era as a port city had faded after the American Revolution, and it could have remained a quiet backwater, a place of shipyards and weathered wooden homes. And yet, by the mid-19th century, something remarkable happened. Newport reinvented itself, not as a commercial center, but as a resort town, a playground for the wealthy who were beginning to seek refuge from the smoky, bustling cities of the Northeast. Imagine arriving in Newport in the 1830s by steamboat. You would have seen rolling green hills, a working harbor, and simple colonial houses, their shingles silvered by salt air. But then, scattered here and there, you'd notice larger homes beginning to appear. Summer cottages, built by southern planters, and northern industrialists alike. They weren't yet the sprawling palaces that would define the Gilded Age, but they were seeds. Each one was a statement. This was a place where you could breathe clean air, escape the heat of New York, and show a touch of prosperity while you were at it. What made Newport different from other coastal towns was its geography and its social timing. The Atlantic crashes dramatically against its cliffs, creating vistas that rival the European coasts of Normandy or the Mediterranean. Its breezes in summer are cooler than New York's stifling heat, a natural air conditioner long before electricity or central cooling. Wealthy families of the antebellum era began to take notice, traveling by steamboat or carriage, staying in boarding houses or modest hotels, before deciding that if Newport was to be their summer refuge, they would need houses of their own. One of the earliest signals of Newport's transformation was the construction of Chateau-sur-Mer, begun in the 1850s. This mansion, owned by the Wetmore family, was one of the first true palatial estates in the town. Its Italianate style stood out dramatically against the simpler colonial homes nearby. Walking past it in that era would have been like stumbling across a miniature palace rising from a fisherman's village. It announced a new kind of Newport, one where wealth was no longer whispered in modest cottages, but shouted in stone and imported materials. By the 1860s and 1870s, the pattern was established. The Industrial Revolution was minting millionaires at a pace America had never seen before. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, and countless others were seeking places not just to live, but to perform their wealth. Newport became their stage. The word cottage took on an ironic meaning. Mansions of 40 or 50 rooms, dripping with marble and chandeliers, were described with that modest term. It was as if calling them cottages softened the ostentation, a wink that fooled no one. But even before the grand marble palaces, the culture of Newport began to change. The town's quiet lanes were filled with carriages in summer. Hotels like the Ocean House offered society balls, while the Cliff Walk allowed visitors to promenade along the sea in their finest clothes. Social rituals began to form: teas, luncheons, and charity events that gave the wealthy a structure in which to interact, compete, and display. For locals, this influx of money was both a blessing and a disruption. Fishermen found themselves living in the shadow of architectural experiments inspired by French castles and Italian villas. The rhythm of summer meant the quiet town would swell with people whose fortunes were measured in railroads and banks, not boats. To picture the contrast, think of Newport like a stage set. On one side, you had weathered wooden homes where generations of Rhode Islanders had lived quietly by the sea. On the other, marble halls rising with imported European art, built for families that often only stayed there for 6 weeks out of the year. The juxtaposition was almost surreal, like watching 2 centuries of history play out side by side. Newport's rise as a summer capital wasn't accidental. It was also fueled by the anxieties of America's wealthy. The Civil War had shaken old structures, immigration was reshaping cities, and industrialization created both fortunes and unrest. For the elite, Newport offered an escape, a place where they could retreat into controlled beauty. The ocean, the fresh air, and the insular community of wealth gave them a sense of safety. Within the manicured gardens of their estates, they could pretend that the problems of the nation were far away. By the time the first great wave of Gilded Age mansions were built in the 1870s and 1880s, Newport had already laid its foundations as America's summer capital. It was no longer just a coastal town. It was a theater for ambition. The streets, once filled with fishermen and sailors, now echoed with the sound of society orchestras. The cliffs, once dotted with lighthouses and modest cottages, now bristled with imported marble and French windows. And yet, beneath it all, the original character of Newport still lingered in the salt air and the working harbor, reminding anyone who looked closely that this transformation was as much performance as permanence. Newport before the Gilded Age was a place in transition, half village, half stage, preparing itself for the arrival of fortunes so vast they needed entire palaces to contain them. And when those fortunes arrived, they found a town ready to crown itself as the summer capital of wealth in America. The Kerry Mansion, Newport's haunted castle. If Newport is America's showcase of marble palaces and gilded dreams, then Seaview Terrace, better known as the Kerry Mansion, sits apart like a Gothic whisper among all that classical grandeur. While the Breakers or Marble House shine in the daylight of Newport society, Seaview Terrace is remembered in shadows. Its stone facade, pointed arches, and echoing halls feel less like a summer cottage and more like something plucked from a European ghost story. To many, it has always been less about wealth and more about atmosphere, a house that seems to hold secrets in its walls. Seaview Terrace is remarkable not only for its appearance, but for its strange history of relocation. Originally built in Washington, D.C. in the early 20th century by whiskey magnate Edson Bradley, the house was an architectural patchwork of Gothic revival, French chateau, and medieval-inspired elements. It boasted cloisters, turrets, stained glass windows, and even sections of salvaged European churches built into its design. Bradley had spared no expense in creating a mansion that was less a home and more a personal cathedral to access. Yet after his death, his widow relocated the entire structure to Newport between 1923 and 1925. Piece by piece, stone by stone, Seaview Terrace was dismantled in Washington and rebuilt overlooking the Atlantic. The move itself was a monumental act, almost as if Bradley's widow had transplanted an entire world into the soil of Rhode Island. Walking up to Seaview Terrace in the 1930s would have been an awe-striking experience. Its grand halls, vaulted ceilings, and carved stone fireplaces gave the impression that one had stepped into a French abbey. The house contained more than 40 rooms, including a two-story Gothic chapel that felt as though it belonged in a medieval monastery. Unlike the bright, airy ballrooms of Marble House or Rosecliffe, Seaview Terrace seemed to draw light inward, creating a dim, mysterious atmosphere. Visitors described it as beautiful, but unsettling, a place where grandeur and gloom met in equal measure. By mid-century, the mansion had begun to fall into decline. Unlike the Vanderbilts or Astors, the Bradley family did not have the generational wealth to maintain such an enormous estate indefinitely. After changing hands several times, it eventually became associated with a very different kind of fame. In the 1960s, Seaview Terrace was immortalized on television as the fictional Collinwood Mansion in the Gothic soap opera Dark Shadows. For millions of Americans, the opening credits of the show, with waves crashing against the cliffs and the camera sweeping across Seaview Terrace, cemented the mansion as a haunted icon. Suddenly, what had once been a personal retreat for one family became one of the most recognizable haunted houses in America's imagination. This association with Dark Shadows reshaped the house's identity. Unlike Marble House, forever linked with suffrage leader Alva Vanderbilt, or the Breakers, synonymous with Vanderbilt excess, Seaview Terrace became the house of ghosts, vampires, and Gothic drama. Tourists came to Newport not only to see the splendor of the Gilded Age, but to catch a glimpse of the haunted castle from their television screens. It was no longer just architecture, it was myth. A place that seemed destined for rumors of hauntings, whispers of hidden passageways, and the sense that it was alive with something beyond history. In truth, Seaview Terrace was also alive with struggle. Maintenance on such a massive property proved daunting, and unlike some other Newport estates, it was not immediately preserved as a museum. In the latter half of the 20th century, the mansion fell into disrepair, its stonework crumbling, its interiors worn down by time and neglect. For a period, it housed classrooms for Salve Regina University, students sitting in what had once been Gothic chapels and cavernous dining halls. Imagine the surreal experience of taking a lecture on literature in a room that looked more suited for monks or ghosts than for college students. Today, Seaview Terrace still carries the aura of mystery. While some Newport mansions glitter with restored chandeliers and manicured lawns, Seaview feels half forgotten, its grandeur softened by ivy and salt air. Passers-by describe it as both enchanting and unsettling, a reminder that not all mansions were built purely for glittering summer balls. Some, like Seaview Terrace, were built as statements of taste, eccentric, Gothic, even brooding. To see it now is to understand the dual face of Newport's mansion era. On one side, the golden light of the Vanderbilts and Astors, on the other, the dark silhouette of a castle that feels almost alive. The Kerry mansion reminds us that the Gilded Age was not a uniform parade of Versailles replicas. It was also an era of experiment, of individual vision, and sometimes of strange, misplaced dreams that could never be fully sustained. And in Newport, that vision still stands, stone by stone, as one of the most atmospheric and uncanny relics of America's age of excess. The Bells Mansion, Fire on the Cliffside. On a quiet stretch of Newport's rugged coastline, where the Atlantic hurls itself against the rocks with endless fury, the skeletal remains of one of the city's most curious mansions still stand. Known as the Bells, or sometimes as the Reef Estate, it tells a story that is equal parts grandeur, tragedy, and strange rebirth. Unlike the gleaming Vanderbilt palaces that dominate tourist brochures, the Bells has been left to the mercy of the elements, a ghost of the Gilded Age whose crumbling walls whisper of past extravagance and sudden decline. The Bells began with Theodore M. Davis, a wealthy lawyer and copper magnate who, like many of his contemporaries, sought to make Newport his summer playground. Davis was no ordinary industrialist. He was also a passionate amateur Egyptologist, sponsoring excavations in the Valley of the Kings, and even claiming to have discovered the tomb of Queen Hatshepsut. That sense of worldliness and spectacle carried over into his Newport home. Built in the late 19th century, the estate was originally called The Reef. It was an elegant yet imposing mansion overlooking the sea, surrounded by lush gardens and stables that housed Davis's prized horses. But the Bells was not just another cottage in Newport's competitive landscape of excess. Its design had a fortress-like quality, with thick walls and a sturdy, almost medieval silhouette. Where Marble House dazzled with Versailles-inspired flourishes, the Bells exuded strength and permanence. Its very name, evoking church bells tolling, added a note of solemnity, as if it was meant to stand as a landmark not only for Davis's wealth but for the ages. Inside, the Bells reflected Davis's eclectic taste. Visitors described large rooms decorated with art collected from his travels, particularly Egypt, where he had spent years sponsoring digs and acquiring artifacts. His Newport estate was less a glittering ballroom space, and more a personal museum, a place where intellectual curiosity met the trappings of wealth. In an era when the super-rich often competed in how flamboyantly they could outshine one another, Davis carved a niche for himself as the worldly gentleman collector. Yet like so many Newport mansions, the Bells was not immune to the tides of history. After Davis's death in 1915, the property fell into disuse. Ownership changed hands, and during World War II, the U.S. Navy commandeered the estate as part of its wartime efforts. The mansion, once filled with Egyptian relics and elegant furnishings, was stripped for military utility. Its echoing halls housed offices and equipment, its gardens trampled by the boots of sailors and soldiers. The war, which consumed so much of Europe's architectural heritage, left its scars in Newport too. The most devastating blow came in the post-war years when fire ravaged the property. Flames tore through the structure, leaving behind charred walls and blackened beams. By the time the smoke cleared, the Bells was reduced to a ruin. Unlike the Breakers or Marble House, which were preserved and later restored, the Bells never recovered. Its carcass remained, exposed to the salt winds and the creeping ivy, a reminder of how quickly grandeur can collapse into rubble. Yet the story did not end in silence. In the decades that followed, the Bells became something stranger, a canvas for street art and a gathering place for those fascinated by ruins. Local artists painted murals on its surviving walls, splashing color across its gray stone bones. Teenagers dared each other to sneak inside at night, trading ghost stories of Davis's spirit, or whispering about Egyptian curses following him home from the Valley of the Kings. What had once been a stage for Gilded Age luxury was now a playground for counterculture, a place where Newport's youth left their marks in spray paint instead of marble. There is something uniquely haunting about walking past the Bells today. Unlike Newport's polished mansions where docents explain the lives of Vanderbilts under glittering chandeliers, the Bells offers no guided tours. It stands in ruin, open to the wind, the sea, and the imagination. Its scorched walls feel almost romantic, like the remnants of a medieval abbey in Europe, and in its decay, it tells a different kind of story about Newport, one not of endless wealth preserved, but of the impermanence of fortune, the way even the grandest homes can be swallowed by time and accident. The Bells contrasts sharply with its neighbors. Just down the coast, the Breakers rises in triumphant order, its marble restored and its lawns manicured as though the Gilded Age never ended. The Bells, meanwhile, slumps in silence, its legacy carried not by official preservation societies, but by the graffiti artists who treat its ruins as an open-air gallery. In this way, it speaks to both the fragility and resilience of Newport's architectural legacy. Not every mansion survives intact, but each one leaves a mark on the landscape and on those who encounter it. Picture standing before it on a foggy evening. The Atlantic churns just beyond the cliffs. Gulls wheel overhead, and the ruin looms like a broken tooth against the sky. You can almost hear the echo of horses in the stables, the murmur of guests in its great halls, the clink of glasses raised by Davis himself. And then, in the silence, you see the paint and murals left by modern hands, proof that even in ruin, the Bells continues to inspire creativity, curiosity, and myth. The Reef Estate, the Bells, whatever name it bears, is perhaps Newport's most unusual mansion, not for its riches, but for its survival in fragments. It remains a cliffside reminder that every era of grandeur carries within it the seeds of decline, and that sometimes the ruins tell stories as powerful as the palaces still standing. Belcourt Castle, horses, Gothic grandeur, and eccentric living. If Newport's mansions were stages upon which the Gilded Age elite played out their fantasies, then Belcourt Castle was perhaps the most eccentric script of them all. Where the Vanderbilts built grand ballrooms for society's approval, and the Astors filled their halls with the rituals of social hierarchy, Belcourt seemed to follow a more personal vision, less about impressing everyone else and more about indulging its owner's whims. It is a mansion that, from the very beginning, was designed to defy convention. Belcourt was commissioned in 1891 by Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, a man whose very name dripped with aristocratic resonance. A member of the wealthy Belmont family, who made their fortune in banking and finance, Oliver had been raised in privilege, but cultivated his own passions, particularly for horses. And so, when he hired the famed architect Richard Morris Hunt, who also designed the breakers, Belmont did not ask for a copy of Versailles to dazzle dinner guests. He asked for a mansion that would center his true love, his stables. The result was unlike anything else in Newport. While other mansions placed grand entrances and ballrooms front and center, Belcourt's main floor was dominated by stables for Belmont's prized thoroughbreds. Imagine stepping into a Newport mansion not to find chandeliers and marble staircases, but polished stalls and the smell of hay mingling with French Gothic arches. Belmont's horses lived in greater style than many people of the era, surrounded by stained glass windows, fine woodwork, and carvings that made their stable feel like a cathedral. Guests at parties were often led first to see the horses, as if they were the true royalty of the house. The design itself was eclectic, a mix of French Renaissance, Gothic Revival, and Hunt's flair for dramatic detail. From the outside, Belcourt looked like a medieval chateau transplanted onto the cliffs of Rhode Island, complete with towers and elaborate stonework. Inside, the decor leaned heavily into Gothic moods, vaulted ceilings, dark wood paneling, stained glass, and an atmosphere that felt more like a European castle than an American summer home. Where the breakers dazzled with light and openness, Belcourt wrapped its visitors in shadow and intensity. Belmont himself was known for his flamboyance. He threw lavish parties at Belcourt, where the unusual layout of the house became a conversation starter. Guests could sip champagne in rooms filled with armor and medieval tapestries before being shown the horses as though they were part of the entertainment. It was eccentric, even by Gilded Age standards, but that was precisely the point. In an era when everyone was competing to outshine each other with marble and chandeliers, Belmont stood out by creating a fantasy that was uniquely his own. After Oliver Belmont's death in 1908, Belcourt entered a new chapter that only deepened its reputation for eccentricity. It passed through various hands, and by the mid-20th century, became less a private mansion and more a museum of oddities. The property was acquired by the Tinney family in 1956, who opened it to the public not simply as a preserved Gilded Age house, but as a showcase of eclectic artifacts. Visitors encountered everything from European armor collections to curiosities that seemed better suited to a cabinet of wonders than a historic home. Belcourt gained a reputation not only for its unusual displays, but also for its supposed hauntings. Guests whispered of spirits lingering in its shadowed halls, tales of flickering lights and cold drafts in rooms filled with medieval relics. Paranormal investigators visited, further fueling the legend that Belcourt was less a house and more a stage for both history and the supernatural. In a city filled with mansions meant to dazzle in daylight, Belcourt's allure came increasingly from its atmosphere at night. Unlike some of Newport's other grand houses, Belcourt never fully fit into a single category. It was not purely a palace for society balls, nor strictly a museum, nor just a home. It was all of those things and none of them depending on the era. That fluid identity made it stand apart in a city where the mansions often carried the weight of family names and rigid traditions. Belcourt seemed to invite strangeness, to encourage eccentricity, to live in the margins of Newport's otherwise orderly social theater. To stand before Belcourt today is to feel that difference. The exterior, with its medieval flourishes, looks more like it belongs on the Loire Valley than in Rhode Island. The stories it contains, of Belmont's horse-filled stables, of public tours through rooms filled with armor, of ghostly whispers and Gothic grandeur, make it less a frozen artifact and more a living legend. Where Marble House represents power and the Breakers speaks to excess, Belcourt whispers of obsessions, personal quirks, and the unpredictable ways wealth can shape architecture. Imagine being a guest in Belmont's day. You arrive expecting a grand ballroom, but instead, you are shown horses treated as nobility, their stalls polished like shrines. Later, you drink under chandeliers while medieval armor glints from the shadows. The night feels like something out of a dream, half European fantasy, half American ambition. And as you leave, the Atlantic winds swirl around the castle-like structure, making you wonder if you've just stepped into history or legend. Belcourt Castle remains one of Newport's most unusual mansions precisely because it refuses to play by the rules. It is not simply abandoned or restored. It is remembered as a space of Gothic grandeur, eccentric living, and curious afterlives. In the long parade of Newport's mansions, it stands as the odd one out, and perhaps the most fascinating because of it. Wildacre, by the sea with the Olmsteds. If most Newport mansions seem designed to overwhelm with marble, chandeliers, and a cascade of European styles, Wildacre offers something different. Perched quietly by the sea, it is not the largest or most ostentatious of the Newport estates, but it holds a rare distinction. It represents a harmony between architecture, landscape, and family legacy. Wildacre is one of those houses that whispers instead of shouts, and in doing so, it tells us something profound about how wealth could be expressed in ways beyond sheer spectacle. Built in 1885, Wildacre was commissioned by the industrialist George R. Fearing and designed by Peabody and Stearns, one of the most prominent architectural firms of the Gilded Age. But the true magic of Wildacre lies not only in its shingle-style architecture, a uniquely American form that embraced wood shingles, asymmetry, and a kind of rustic elegance, but also in its surrounding landscape, crafted by none other than Frederick Law Olmsted, the father of American landscape architecture. Olmsted, famous for designing New York's Central Park, sought to blend Wildacre into its natural setting rather than impose upon it. This was an unusual choice in Newport, where many of the grand houses seemed determined to dominate their environment. The Breakers, Marble House, Rosecliffe, all are spectacles rising above their lawns like palaces imported from Europe. Wildacre, by contrast, sits gently on the land, its shingles weathered by the salt air, its grounds rolling naturally toward the ocean. Olmsted designed the landscape to enhance the feeling of seclusion, with winding paths and plantings that framed the sea like a living painting. Walking its grounds felt less like striding onto a stage and more like wandering into a private sanctuary. The house itself reflects the shingle style's emphasis on blending indoors and outdoors. Rooms flow into verandas, windows frame ocean views, and the materials feel organic rather than imposed. In this way, Wildacre represents a different kind of Gilded Age dream. Not a castle of excess, but a seaside retreat where nature and architecture worked in concert. It was the sort of place where one might spend long afternoons reading on a porch, or hosting intimate gatherings, rather than dazzling hundreds with a society ball. But as with all Newport mansions, the story of Wildacre is not only one of design, but also of family. The estate became tied to the Ulrichs family, one of Newport's most notable clans, known for their connection to Rosecliffe and their presence in high society. Through marriages and inheritances, Wildacre found itself within the larger web of Newport's dynasties, its quiet elegance standing in contrast to the flamboyance of its neighbors. It was a house that could accommodate privilege without demanding spectacle, a place where family ties could play out against the steady rhythm of the sea. Preservation, however, would not come easily. Unlike Marble House or the Breakers, which became near-instant icons of excess worth saving, Wildacre's subtlety made it vulnerable. Throughout the 20th century, as Newport's economy shifted and many mansions fell into decline, Wildacre faced the threat of being lost. Preservationists argued that its architectural and landscape significance, particularly the Olmsted connection, made it a treasure equal to its flashier peers. Battles over its upkeep and future ownership underscored a broader truth about Newport. Not all mansions survived because of their size or their fame. Some survived because people fought for them. Standing at Wildacre today, one can sense that it belongs to a different rhythm of the Gilded Age. Imagine walking the grounds in the late 19th century. The salty wind blowing through the grasses, the clap of waves against the rocks, and the house itself rising not as a fortress, but as a companion to the landscape. Guests would wander through Olmsted's paths, perhaps pausing at a bench designed to frame the horizon. Inside, the wood-paneled rooms would glow warmly against the Atlantic chill, offering comfort rather than spectacle. In this way, Wildacre represents an alternate thread of Newport's story. It was not just about wealth displayed, but wealth expressed through restraint, through harmony with nature, through a belief that luxury could mean quietude as much as grandeur. For those used to the towering presence of the Breakers or the polished Versailles mimicry of Marble House, Wildacre must have felt almost radical in its understatement. Yet, this understatement is precisely what has made it significant. In a city where so many mansions risk becoming caricatures of excess, Wildacre stands as proof that the Gilded Age contained multitudes. It was an age not only of glitter and marble, but also of experiments in how to live, how to shape space, how to balance human ambition with natural beauty. Olmsted's touch, visible in every curve of the landscape, reminds us that the Gilded Age was not just about conquering nature with stone, but sometimes about bending wealth to serve the poetry of place. To see Wildacre is to glimpse a Newport that might have been one less about spectacle, more about subtlety, a Newport where mansions could be sanctuaries instead of stages. And in that rare balance, Wildacre has etched itself into the city's legacy as one of its most quietly powerful estates. Beachwood, the Astor's social theater. If Newport had a throne room during the Gilded Age, it was not inside the marble walls of the Vanderbilt's Breakers or the gilded corridors of Marble House. It was within the Italianate villa known as Beachwood, where Caroline Webster Schermerhorn Astor, the Mrs. Astor, reigned as the undisputed queen of New York and Newport society. While other mansions dazzled with architecture, Beachwood's power came from something less tangible, but far more potent. It was the stage where social hierarchy was performed, negotiated, and enforced. Built originally in 1851 for Daniel Parrish, a wealthy New Yorker, Beachwood was later remodeled and expanded by architect Richard Morris Hunt in 1881, specifically to meet Mrs. Astor's demands. Hunt, who would go on to design Marble House and the Breakers, created a home that balanced elegance with social functionality. Beachwood was not meant to outshine in size. It was relatively modest compared to Vanderbilt Estates, but to command in purpose. Its ballrooms, dining spaces, and gardens were arranged with one central idea: to be the setting for the most exclusive social events in America. Caroline Astor ruled society through what became known as the 400, a reference to the roughly 400 individuals deemed acceptable for her guest lists. To be invited to Beachwood was to be stamped with approval, to have your name etched into the social fabric of the elite. The ballroom of Beachwood, though smaller than the Breakers' grand halls, was the true crucible of status. It was here that one's lineage, wealth, and manners were tested under Mrs. Astor's gaze. As contemporaries noted, she was less interested in new money flaunting itself than in carefully preserving the traditions of old money society. Imagine the scene on a summer evening in the 1880s. Gas lamps glowed, carriages pulled up to Beachwood's entrance, and guests in diamonds and silk stepped into the ballroom. The orchestra swelled, but everyone's attention ultimately drifted to Mrs. Astor, seated like a monarch, her presence a silent reminder that power in America was not just measured in millions of dollars, but in who held the keys to social acceptance. Conversations were not idle. They were performances, each word weighed for propriety. To dance at Beachwood was not merely to dance. It was to step onto a stage where your reputation might be made or destroyed. In this sense, Beachwood was less a house than a theater. Its walls absorbed the rituals of America's elite, the carefully orchestrated dinners, the debutante presentations, the subtle battles between old money and the new industrial fortunes. While the Vanderbilts built palaces of marble, they often struggled for legitimacy in Mrs. Astor's eyes. It was only after Alva Vanderbilt hosted her infamous ball at Marble House, forcing the gates of high society open, that Beachwood's exclusivity began to be challenged. Even then, Beachwood remained the emblem of social tradition, the place where the Astors' authority was most vividly felt. But time, as always, brought change. By the early 20th century, the Astors' influence waned, and the new titans of industry, the Vanderbilts, Goulds, and later the Morgans, had redefined American aristocracy through sheer scale of wealth. Beachwood, however, still retained its aura. Even as Newport entered the age of preservation and tourism, Beachwood's history as a social theater made it stand apart. Its importance was not in how large it was, but in what it represented, the codification of social rules in a time when America's identity was still being shaped. The house itself, with its Italianate style and dignified proportions, carries this legacy in stone. The stucco facade, the arched windows, the shaded verandas, they are not flamboyant, but they speak of refinement. The ballroom, though not the largest in Newport, still carries the echo of orchestras and murmured conversations. To walk through Beachwood is to sense not only the physical space, but the invisible hierarchies that once gave it life. In the late 20th century, Beachwood entered yet another act in its long drama when it was purchased by Oracle co-founder Larry Ellison, one of the richest men in the world. Ellison, captivated by Newport's mansions, sought to restore Beachwood not only as a home, but as a museum dedicated to the Gilded Age. His vision was ambitious, to revive the house's role as a center of cultural and social life, albeit in a modern context. Ellison's involvement added a curious symmetry. Another billionaire, another attempt to use Beachwood as a stage for influence. This transition underscores the peculiar endurance of Beachwood's identity. Unlike the Breakers, which is frozen in its Vanderbilt grandeur, or Marble House preserved as Alva Vanderbilt's Versailles, Beachwood's essence is less about marble and more about people. It was and remains a house defined by gatherings, by the social theater enacted within its walls. Whether under Mrs. Astor's rule or Ellison's patronage, Beachwood's legacy lies in its ability to host and to signify belonging or exclusion. Picture standing in the ballroom today. The chandeliers may glitter as they did in Mrs. Astor's time, but the silence feels heavy, as though waiting for music to strike up and gowns to sweep across the floor. The walls still carry the memory of conversations where reputations were weighed. Beachwood may not be as famous as the Breakers, but in many ways it is more revealing. It shows that the Gilded Age was not just about wealth displayed in stone, but about social rituals performed on the stage of a mansion. Beachwood endures as a symbol of power wielded quietly but decisively, a house where the theater of society mattered more than the architecture itself. And in Newport, where palaces compete for grandeur, Beachwood's true brilliance lies in the invisible authority that once pulsed through its walls. Marble House, Alva Vanderbilt's palace of feminist power. Among all of Newport's glittering cottages, few capture the contradictions of the Gilded Age more powerfully than Marble House. At first glance, it seems like the ultimate expression of excess, a Versailles transplanted onto the Rhode Island coast, shimmering with over 500,000 cubic feet of marble imported from around the world. Yet beneath its glittering facade lay a deeper story, one of ambition, rebellion, and even activism. For its mistress, Alva Vanderbilt, Marble House was not just a palace of privilege. It was a stage upon which she redefined her own power and, unexpectedly, lent her voice to one of the most important political movements of her time. Completed in 1892 and designed by Richard Morris Hunt, Marble House was gifted to Alva by her husband, William K. Vanderbilt, as a 39th birthday present. The cost was staggering, about $11 million at the time, over $350 million today. The Vanderbilts, though immensely wealthy, were still considered new money compared to the Astors and other old guard families. For Alva, the house was more than a home. It was a weapon in the social wars of Newport and New York. With its gilded salons, French-inspired gardens, and ballroom glittering with gold leaf, Marble House was designed to announce the Vanderbilts belonged at the very top of society. The architecture itself embodied this declaration. Hunt modeled the design after the Petit Trianon at Versailles, but on a scale far larger and grander. The exterior gleamed with white marble, while the interiors dazzled with gilded moldings, frescoed ceilings, and carved fireplaces. To walk into Marble House was to be transported to the 18th century France, with the kind of opulence that even the Astors found difficult to ignore. This was Alva's Versailles, her throne from which she could command attention. And command it she did. Alva was not content to play the passive role expected of society wives. She was fiercely ambitious, determined to carve a place for herself and her family in the upper echelons of American aristocracy. Marble House was her proof of power. Here, she hosted elaborate balls and dinners that rivaled those of Caroline Astor, throwing open the doors to Newport society and forcing the old guard to acknowledge her. Guests would arrive by carriage, ascending the marble steps into a world of glittering chandeliers and music, where every detail was curated to reinforce the Vanderbilts' legitimacy. But Alva's story did not end with social conquest. In the years following her divorce from William, a bold and scandalous act at the time, she began to use her platform for causes that extended beyond personal ambition. By the early 20th century, Alva had become a prominent supporter of women's suffrage, and Marble House, once a stage for her social battles, became a stage for political ones. She hosted suffrage rallies on the lawn, transforming a symbol of Gilded Age extravagance into a platform for feminist power. Imagine the scene. A mansion that once echoed with waltzes and gossip, now filled with voices calling for the vote. The same marble steps that had ushered in dukes, duchesses, and society's elite now welcomed women activists. Banners unfurled, speeches delivered against the backdrop of gilded opulence. For Alva, the irony was not lost. She had used Marble House to assert her dominance in a rigid social hierarchy, and now she used it to challenge an even deeper hierarchy, the exclusion of women from political life. Her involvement was not superficial. Alva became the first president of the National Woman's Party and helped finance efforts that eventually led to the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. While critics noted that her wealth insulated her from the harsher realities most suffragists faced, her visibility and resources gave the movement momentum. Marble House was no longer just a monument to Vanderbilt ambition. It was a weapon in the fight for equality. The dual identity of Marble House is what makes it so fascinating. On one hand, it is the epitome of Gilded Age excess, its marble halls and gilded ceilings embodying a world where fortunes were flaunted like crowns. On the other hand, it is a reminder that even within that world of luxury, individuals could wield power in unexpected ways. Alva Vanderbilt, often dismissed as simply ambitious or domineering, used her palace not only to elevate her family name, but also to press forward one of the most important causes of her era. To walk through Marble House today is to see these layers. The banquet hall, with its soaring ceilings and glittering chandeliers, still radiates opulence. The Gothic room, filled with Alva's medieval collection, whispers of her eclectic taste. But the true spirit of Marble House lies not just in its interiors, but in the memory of the women who gathered there to demand change. Picture it. Banners draped across the balustrades, voices rising against the backdrop of the Atlantic winds, and Alva herself, once the queen of society, standing at the forefront of a political revolution. Marble House was never just marble. It was ambition carved into stone, and later it became a pulpit for progress. In Newport, where so many mansions remain monuments to wealth alone, Marble House carries a more complex legacy. It is both Versailles on the Rhode Island coast and a landmark in the history of American feminism, a place where marble and power intertwined in ways that still echo today. The Breakers, Vanderbilt excess on the Atlantic. If there is one mansion that defines Newport in the American imagination, it is the Breakers. Rising above the Atlantic like a Renaissance fortress gilded with American ambition, it is not only the largest of Newport's summer cottages, but also its most iconic. For many, the Breakers is the shorthand for the Gilded Age itself, wealth without limit, opulence without restraint, and a house so monumental it seemed less a residence than a monument to the power of one family, the Vanderbilts. The story of the Breakers begins with Cornelius Vanderbilt II, grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, the shipping and railroad titan who laid the foundations of the family fortune. By the late 19th century, the Vanderbilts had become the wealthiest clan in America, their railroads tying together the nation's commerce like veins of steel. But wealth on such a scale demanded symbols, and in Newport, where fortunes competed in brick, marble, and gilding, Cornelius II would create his masterpiece. The first house on the site, a wooden structure, was destroyed by fire in 1892. For Cornelius II, the disaster was an opportunity, and he wasted no time in commissioning Richard Morris Hunt, America's preeminent architect of the Gilded Age, to design something that would eclipse every rival. Hunt looked to the Italian Renaissance palaces of Genoa and Turin for inspiration, blending Old World grandeur with New World scale. What emerged was a mansion of 70 rooms, 62,000 square feet, and a price tag of $7 million at the time, over $200 million today. The Breakers was not just big, it was overwhelming. Its facade of limestone rose 3 stories above the sea, while its interiors shimmered with marble, mosaics, and gilded ornamentation. The Great Hall soared nearly 50 feet high, its vaulted ceiling painted with allegorical frescoes that made visitors feel as if they had entered a European cathedral rather than a private home. The dining room glittered with baccarat crystal chandeliers, while the music room gleamed with gold leaf and elaborate plasterwork. Everywhere, the house announced this was not simply wealth, it was dynastic power set in stone. But the Breakers was also carefully designed as a stage for society. Its rooms were arranged to maximize spectacle, from the vast reception areas meant for hundreds of guests to the terraces overlooking the crashing Atlantic waves. Imagine stepping into the ballroom on a summer night, the sound of an orchestra swelling, women in gowns sparkling with diamonds, and men in black tie discussing railroads, politics, and fortunes. The air was thick not only with perfume but with ambition, each guest subtly measuring their place in the Vanderbilt orbit. And yet beneath the glitter, the house also reflected the contradictions of the age. The same Vanderbilt fortune that built the Breakers also fueled public resentment toward monopolies and the concentration of wealth. To ordinary Americans, the mansion was both awe-inspiring and offensive. a palace on the cliffs at a time when many struggled simply to feed their families. The breakers stood as the most visible symbol of both the triumph and the inequity of the Gilded Age. After Cornelius Vanderbilt II's death in 1899, the house remained in the family but never quite regained its original vitality. His widow, Alice Gwynne Vanderbilt, continued to preside over it for decades, maintaining the rituals of Newport society even as the world around her shifted. By the mid-20th century, however, the fortunes of the Vanderbilts, once inexhaustible, had waned. Many of their grand houses in New York were demolished, and even the breakers faced uncertainty. It was the Preservation Society of Newport County that ultimately ensured the breakers' survival. In 1948, Alice Vanderbilt's daughter leased the house to the society, allowing it to be open to the public as a museum. Visitors who once could only imagine the Vanderbilt lifestyle now walked through its gilded halls, gazing at marble fireplaces large enough to stand in, and ceilings painted with gods and muses. The breakers became not only a monument to one family but also to an entire era, preserved as a national symbol of excess and ambition. Today, the breakers receives hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, making it the most visited historic house in America. Its role has shifted from private theater of the elite to public museum of the Gilded Age. Yet even in preservation, the house carries the aura of its past. Standing on the terrace, with the Atlantic crashing against the rocks below, one can imagine Cornelius II surveying his empire, the iron rails stretching across the continent, the wealth flowing into his coffers, and his palace on the sea standing as proof that the Vanderbilts had conquered not only commerce but also society itself. The breakers is often described as the crown jewel of Newport, but perhaps it is more than that. It is a paradox carved in limestone, both a triumph of artistry and a symbol of inequality, both breathtakingly beautiful and uncomfortably excessive. To step inside is to feel the awe of marble and gilding, but also to sense the weight of history pressing down, the reminder that behind every chandelier and fresco were railroads, laborers, strikes, and fortunes built on the sweat of countless others. More than a century after its construction, the breakers still looms over Newport like a fortress of ambition. It is, in every sense, the mansion that defines the Gilded Age, unrestrained, unapologetic, and unforgettable. Rosecliffe, the house of parties and Hollywood dreams. If the breakers was Newport's cathedral of power and marble house its Versailles of ambition, then Rosecliffe was its ballroom of dreams. Built not to intimidate but to enchant, Rosecliffe embodies the romance and spectacle of Newport society at its most theatrical. From glittering soirees to film crews capturing Gatsby-era magic, the mansion tells a story less about dynasties and more about delight, about how architecture, wealth, and imagination combine to create a place where reality blurred with performance. Rosecliffe was commissioned in 1899 by Teresa Tessie Fair Elricks, daughter of Silver Baron James Graham Fair of Nevada's Comstock Lode. Tessie was part of that wave of Western fortunes that swept eastward in the late 19th century, bringing the raw energy of mining wealth into the refined world of Newport's summer colony, where the Vanderbilts and Astors were rooted in railroads and old social networks. Tessie embodied the audacity of new money, determined to prove that Nevada silver could gleam as brightly as any Vanderbilt railroad. To achieve this, she turned to the renowned architect Stanford White of McKim, Mead and White, who crafted for her a mansion modeled after the Grand Trianon at Versailles. But Rosecliffe was lighter, airier, and designed with a singular purpose: to entertain. The house, completed in 1902, was far smaller than the Breakers or Marble House, just 30 rooms compared to their 60 or 70, but its scale was deceptive. Rosecliffe was a palace of proportions, where the balance of line and ornament created a sense of grace. The shining white stucco, the sweeping lawns, and the glittering ballroom seemed designed not to overwhelm, but to seduce. Inside, the mansion's centerpiece was its ballroom, one of the largest in Newport, capable of hosting 1,000 guests. Imagine the scene on a summer evening. Chandeliers ablaze, an orchestra playing waltzes, champagne flowing, and gowns glittering as dancers moved across the polished parquet floor. The ballroom opened directly onto terraces and gardens, allowing parties to spill into the moonlight, the sound of laughter mingling with the crash of waves against the cliffs. Tessie Ulrichs knew how to use this stage. She became one of Newport's most famous hostesses, her parties attracting not only the American elite, but also European aristocrats, artists, and politicians. Guests spoke of nights that seemed to belong more to fairy tales than to real life, where the house itself became a character in the drama of wealth and imagination. Rosecliffe was not built to outmuscle the breakers in grandeur. It was built to outshine it in joy. Yet, as with all Gilded Age dreams, there was an undercurrent of fragility. Tessie herself died relatively young in 1926, and Rosecliffe began to pass through other hands, its ballroom echoing with memories more than music. By the mid-20th century, Newport's fortunes had shifted, and many of its mansions teetered between ruin and reinvention. Rosecliffe, however, found new life not only through preservation, but through the silver screen. Hollywood discovered Rosecliffe, and it quickly became one of the most famous film sets in Newport. Its ballroom and gardens appeared in movies such as The Great Gatsby, 1974, starring Robert Redford and Mia Farrow, True Lies, 1994, and 27 Dresses, 2008. Each film captured a different aspect of Rosecliffe's personality. Its Gatsby-era glamour, its theatrical spaces, its ability to transform into whatever dream the camera required. To watch those films is to see Rosecliffe play itself, a star among the actors, proof that architecture can embody fantasy as powerfully as fiction. But the house was not just a stage for Hollywood, it was also a stage for Newport's evolving identity. In the latter half of the 20th century, Rosecliffe became one of the Preservation Society of Newport County's crown jewels, open to the public as a museum. Visitors walked through its white halls and glittering ballroom, imagining themselves as dancers in Tessie's parties or extras in a Hollywood film. The preservation of Rosecliffe ensured that its story remained alive, not just as a relic of the Gilded Age, but as a living dream still capable of inspiring awe. Standing on Rosecliffe's terrace today, one sees the Atlantic stretching endlessly beyond the manicured lawns, the horizon glowing with the same light that once illuminated gowns and champagne glasses. The house itself feels both timeless and theatrical, a reminder that the Gilded Age was not only about power and wealth, but also about spectacle, fantasy, and the desire to create worlds larger than life. Rosecliffe's enduring charm lies in this duality. It is at once a monument to silver barons and society queens and a playground for filmmakers and dreamers. Unlike the Breakers, which insists on its dominance, or Marble House, which asserts its authority, Rosecliffe invites enchantment. It is less a fortress of ambition than a ballroom of imagination, where parties never truly end, and where every visitor becomes part of the performance. In Newport's pantheon of mansions, Rosecliffe shines as the house of dreams, where Gilded Age extravagance met Hollywood fantasy, and where, even today, the echo of music and laughter lingers in the salt air. Ochre Court, from social glory to Salve Regina University. On Newport's rugged cliff walk, with the Atlantic roaring at its feet, stands a house that seems pulled straight from the Loire Valley in France. Ochre Court, with its turrets, steep slate roofs, and delicate Gothic details, is one of the most imposing of Newport's mansions, an estate that once glittered with balls and receptions, but now echoes with the footsteps of students hurrying to class. Its story, stretching from the peak of Gilded Age society to the halls of higher learning, reveals how even the most extravagant creations of wealth can evolve into something entirely unexpected. Ochre Court was completed in 1892, the same year as Alva Vanderbilt's Marble House, and designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the architectural magician of Newport who seemed able to conjure European grandeur out of American ambition. Commissioned by Ogden Gourlay, a wealthy New York real estate magnate, Ochre Court cost around $4.5 million, equivalent to more than $150 million today. Hunt looked to the French Renaissance chateau of the Loire for inspiration, giving the house soaring gables, traceried windows, and sculpted stone figures that seemed to gaze down from the facades like guardians of a medieval dream. The house was immense, 50 rooms spread across 3 floors, filled with carved fireplaces, stained glass windows, and ceilings painted with biblical and allegorical scenes. Visitors were greeted with a grand staircase rising beneath a vaulted ceiling that could rival a European cathedral. Ochre Court's ballroom, with its gilded ornamentation and tall arched windows overlooking the sea, quickly became one of Newport's most coveted venues for society gatherings. To be invited to an event at Ochre Court was to step into a fairy tale. The Goleys, though not as flamboyant as the Vanderbilts, were a powerful and respected family, and they used their chateau to cement their place in the upper echelons of Newport society. The estate's lawns rolled down toward the cliffs, where the crashing waves seemed to provide their own dramatic soundtrack. Inside, orchestras played beneath glittering chandeliers as gowns swept across the floors and conversations sparkled with the politics, romances, and rivalries of the age. And yet, beneath the glamour, the house bore the same contradiction as many Gilded Age mansions. It was built on fortunes that dwarfed the earnings of ordinary Americans. A palace of marble and stained glass at a time when many lived in cramped tenements. For Newport's elite, Ochre Court was a playground. For the rest of America, it was another symbol of a widening gap between opulence and reality. After Ogden Gourlay's death, the mansion passed to his descendants, but like so many Newport estates, it became increasingly difficult to maintain. By the mid-20th century, the cost of preserving such a massive structure had become prohibitive. While Marble House and the Breakers eventually found salvation through the Preservation Society, Ochre Court's destiny took a different turn. In 1947, the Gourlay family donated Ochre Court to a newly established Catholic institution, Salve Regina College, now Salve Regina University. What had once been a stage for society balls became the centerpiece of a campus dedicated to learning, a transformation as surprising as it was symbolic. Students began attending classes in rooms once filled with chandeliers and frescoes. The grand ballroom hosted dances of an entirely different kind, and the terrace overlooking the Atlantic became a favorite spot for quiet study rather than champagne receptions. The transition was not without irony. Imagine the ghosts of Gilded Age guests watching students in jeans and backpacks rushing through the halls where once carriages deposited the cream of society. Where conversations once revolved around marriages, inheritances, and fortunes, they now concerned exams, lectures, and student life. Yet in many ways, this transformation saved Ochre Court from the fate of ruin that befell other Newport mansions. Education, not excess, preserved its walls. Today, Ochre Court serves as the administrative heart of Salve Regina University. Its chapel-like interiors and ornate halls provide a daily reminder of the Gilded Age's reach into the present. Students eat lunch in rooms where society queens once plotted guest lists, and professors work in offices that were once bedrooms for the Gourlay's guests. The mansion lives on, not as a relic, but as a working part of Newport's community. There is something almost poetic in this evolution. The house that once symbolized wealth beyond imagination now symbolizes opportunity, growth, and the democratization of space. Ochre Court reminds us that the grand mansions of Newport are not frozen in amber. They continue to adapt, to find new lives beyond the glitter of the Gilded Age. Stand outside Ochre Court today and the view is as dramatic as ever, the Atlantic stretching endlessly, waves battering the cliffs, gulls circling in the salt wind. But instead of carriages rolling up, you see students crossing the lawns, books in hand, laughter carrying across the grounds. The chateau is still alive, still commanding, but its purpose has shifted from exclusivity to inclusivity. Ochre Court is a story of transformation, of how one of Newport's grandest mansions became something even more enduring than a social palace, a home for knowledge, community, and the kind of legacy that outlasts even marble. Rough Point, Doris Duke's Sanctuary of Scandal. Perched dramatically on Newport's windswept southern shore, Rough Point feels different from many of the city's other Gilded Age palaces, where the Breakers dominates with scale and Marble House dazzles with marble and gilt. Rough Point carries a quieter power. Its lines are more restrained, its stone walls grounded against the Atlantic like a medieval fortress. But within those walls unfolded a story of privilege, eccentricity, and scandal, woven around one of the most enigmatic figures of the American 20th century, Doris Duke. Rough Point was originally built in 1887 for Frederick W. Vanderbilt, a member of the family dynasty whose name defined the age. Designed by the architectural firm Peabody and Stearns, the mansion was modeled in the English manorial style, with gabled roofs, massive chimneys, and an imposing, almost brooding presence on its 39 oceanfront acres. Unlike the French-inspired glitter of Rosecliffe or the Renaissance grandeur of the Breakers, Rough Point seemed designed for permanence, a house that could weather centuries of storms rolling in from the Atlantic. But the house's destiny shifted when it was purchased in 1922 by James Buchanan Duke, the tobacco and energy tycoon whose fortune reshaped the South and funded Duke University. His daughter, Doris Duke, inherited Rough Point at just 12 years old, following his death in 1925. Overnight, she became one of the richest little girls in the world, often dubbed the richest girl on Earth. Rough Point, with its sweeping lawns and Atlantic cliffs, became both her inheritance and her burden. As Doris grew, the mansion evolved with her. Unlike other Newport houses that became more like museums than homes, Rough Point remained lived in, a place where Doris installed her tastes, her quirks, and her contradictions. She filled the house with treasures collected during her extensive travels: Islamic art, Southeast Asian sculptures, Renaissance tapestries, and modern pieces side by side. The interiors became a reflection of her eclectic spirit, a cosmopolitan mix that defied the static grandeur of other Newport mansions. Yet Rough Point's reputation is inseparable from Doris Duke herself, a woman who fascinated and confounded the public. She was philanthropic, funding medical research, historic preservation, and the arts, yet also fiercely private and often embroiled in controversy. Newport locals whispered about her unconventional behavior, from her penchant for raising camels on the property to her high-profile relationships. The mansion, standing aloof against the sea, seemed to embody her mix of glamour and mystery. The most enduring scandal tied to Rough Point occurred in 1966, when Doris was behind the wheel of a station wagon that struck and killed her longtime designer and friend, Eduardo Tirella, just outside the estate's gates. The incident was ruled an accident by police, but rumors swirled for decades. Tirella had reportedly been planning to leave Doris's employ, and skeptics claimed the circumstances were suspicious. Newport society, already fascinated by Doris's eccentricities, now had a tragedy that bordered on the Gothic. Rough Point's gates, once symbols of exclusivity, became synonymous with whispers of death and cover-up. Despite the shadows, Doris continued to live and invest in Rough Point throughout her life. She resisted the trend of turning Newport mansions into static museums during her lifetime, instead keeping the estate active and personal. The gardens remained lush, the interiors vibrant with her collections, the house alive with her presence. Unlike the Breakers, which became a monument to the past, Rough Point felt like a lived-in sanctuary, eccentric, private, and very much tied to its mistress's personality. When Doris Duke died in 1993, she left Rough Point to the Newport Restoration Foundation, the organization she had founded decades earlier to save and preserve historic buildings throughout the city. Today, Rough Point is open to the public, but unlike many other mansions, it has been preserved as Doris left it. Visitors walk through rooms where her furniture still sits, her art still hangs, her odd juxtapositions of treasures still fill the halls. It feels less like a time capsule of the Gilded Age and more like stepping into the layered mind of one of America's most elusive heiresses. To stand on Rough Point's terrace today, the Atlantic crashing below, is to sense both the grandeur and the ghosts of the estate. The stone house exudes strength, but the air is heavy with memory of Doris's childhood inheritance, her eccentric adulthood, and the controversies that clung to her name. Unlike the polished perfection of Rosecliffe or Marble House, Rough Point embraces its contradictions, wearing them like weathered stone against the sea. In Newport's pantheon of mansions, Rough Point stands apart. It is not simply a relic of Gilded Age excess, but a layered story of one woman's life, her wealth, her passions, her scandals, and her mysteries, all bound to a house that feels as indomitable and unpredictable as she was. It reminds us that the great estates of Newport were never just about architecture. They were about the lives lived inside them. And in Doris Duke's case, those lives were anything but ordinary. Vinland, mysticism and the Gothic imagination. Tucked into the tapestry of Newport's famed cliff walk is a mansion that feels less like a summer cottage and more like a dream conjured from myth and literature. Vinland, completed in 1883, stands as one of Newport's most atmospheric estates. While Marble House dazzles with Versailles' grandeur and the Breakers overwhelms with Renaissance scale, Vinland draws you in with a mood, half medieval romance, half Gothic reverie, as though its stones were set not merely to impress, but to whisper of older, more mysterious worlds. The estate was commissioned by Catherine Lorillard Wolfe, heiress to the Lorillard tobacco fortune, and one of the few unmarried women of her era to commission a grand Newport home entirely on her own. This independence itself was striking. Where most mansions represented the ambitions of dynasties or couples, Vinland was born of a woman's vision. Wolfe was known for her cultural passions. She was an art collector, philanthropist, and a deeply spiritual figure. She endowed galleries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and carried with her a fascination for myth and literature that shaped her Newport estate. The name Vinland itself drew from Norse legend, the land of vines supposedly reached by Leif Erikson centuries before Columbus. The Gothic mansion, designed by the architectural firm Peabody and Stearns, reflected that same romantic imagination. Built of red sandstone with steep gables, heavy arches, and stained glass windows, Vinland looked less like a summer retreat and more like a medieval abbey overlooking the sea. Its presence suggested permanence, as though it had been planted on Newport's cliffs not in the 19th century but in some forgotten past. Inside, the mansion carried Wolfe's artistic and spiritual sensibilities. The rooms were richly paneled in wood, filled with art and objects that reflected her taste for history and allegory. A chapel-like atmosphere permeated the interiors, where the play of light through stained glass created shifting colors that changed with the hour of the day. It was, in many ways, a house designed to evoke reverie, to draw its visitors not into society but into contemplation. Wolfe's death in 1887 ended the house's first chapter, but Vinland's mystique only grew as it passed to new owners. In the early 20th century, it was acquired by the Berwind family, the same dynasty that built the Elms. Yet Vinland never became a stage for glittering parties in the way that other Newport estates did. Instead, it maintained its aura of quiet mystery, standing almost aloof from the pageantry of Gilded Age society. By the mid-20th century, like so many of Newport's mansions, Vinland faced uncertainty. But rather than slipping into ruin, it found a new and unexpected role when it was acquired by Salve Regina University in the 1950s. The Gothic mansion, with its castle-like silhouette, became part of a campus dedicated to education. Today, it houses classrooms and offices, and students pass daily through its halls, learning beneath vaulted ceilings where Catherine Wolfe once displayed her art. The transformation of Vinland into an academic space feels fitting. The house's aura of mysticism and imagination has been carried forward not through parties or pageantry, but through ideas. For the students who study there, the mansion's Gothic architecture serves as a reminder of history's weight and the strange ways in which wealth, art, and education intertwine. Imagine sitting in a literature seminar beneath stained glass windows that glow with the same light Wolfe once admired, or writing a paper at a desk where the sea crashes audibly against the cliffs below. Vinland has also nurtured its share of legends. Locals whisper of ghostly presences in its halls, of its medieval style lending itself too easily to stories of hauntings. Some say Wolf herself lingers, a benevolent figure watching over the institution that grew from her home. Others simply marvel at how a house so steeped in Gothic imagination seems destined to inspire tales of the supernatural. Whether or not one believes in ghosts, there's no denying that Vinland's mood, its heavy stone, its shadowed windows, its sense of timelessness, invites such stories. What sets Vinland apart from Newport's other grand houses is not just its architecture, but its intention. While Marble House and the Breakers were built to assert power and dazzle rivals, Vinland was built to evoke meaning. It was a house born of myth, imagination, and spirituality. Its survival, repurposed for education, underscores how such qualities can outlast even the brightest chandeliers or the grandest ballrooms. To stand before Vinland today with the Atlantic rolling below and its Gothic arches rising against the sky is to see a different face of the Gilded Age. Here, wealth was not expressed in sheer size or scale, but in atmosphere, in the creation of a house that feels like a story told in stone. Vinland remains Newport's most literary mansion, a place where mysticism and Gothic imagination live on, now joined by the voices of students, carrying its legacy forward into the future. Isaac Bell House, simplicity amid splendor. In a city where marble palaces and French chateaux rise like monuments to ambition, the Isaac Bell House stands apart. It does not glitter with gilded ceilings or overwhelm with 70-room floor plans. Instead, this mansion speaks in a softer voice, one that values proportion, craftsmanship, and quiet innovation over spectacle. In many ways, it is Newport's architectural rebel, a home that rejected the heavy-handed grandeur of the Gilded Age and instead embraced a new American ideal, the shingle style. Built in 1883 for Isaac Bell Jr., a wealthy cotton broker and son-in-law of publisher James Gordon Bennett Jr., the house was designed by the firm McKim, Mead & White, the most influential architectural office of its time. At first glance, the house might have seemed almost understated compared to Marble House or the Breakers. Its exterior, clad in weathered wooden shingles, lacked the carved marble and ornate facades of its contemporaries. But this simplicity was deceptive. It was a deliberate choice, a rejection of imported European pomp in favor of something more organic and distinctly American. The shingle style, which the Isaac Bell House helped popularize, emphasized continuity and flow. Instead of breaking the house into rigid compartments or layering on ornament, the architects used sweeping lines of shingles to unify the exterior. The result was a house that blended with its environment, its curves and textures harmonizing with Newport's coastal setting. Where other mansions loomed, the Isaac Bell House seemed to grow out of the land itself. Inside, the innovation continued. The floor plan was open and flexible, a departure from the rigid symmetry of most Newport houses. Rooms flowed into one another with sliding doors and wide arches creating a sense of movement. Large windows framed views of the gardens, pulling nature inside, while porches and verandas extended living spaces outward. The interiors emphasized craftsmanship, carved wood, exposed beams, and subtle details that celebrated materials rather than hiding them under gilding. For Isaac Bell and his family, the house reflected not only wealth, but also taste. Bell was part of a new class of Americans who wanted their homes to express sophistication without ostentation. In an age when the Vanderbilts were importing Versailles to Rhode Island, the Bells embraced something more modern and progressive. Their house became a manifesto in wood and shingle, declaring that American architecture could stand on its own terms. Yet, for all its restraint, the Isaac Bell House was far from plain. It was filled with subtle luxuries. A Japanese-inspired screen here, a Dutch-style stair hall there, an eclectic mix of global influences, woven together with elegance. Walking through its rooms in the 1880s would have been a revelation, not because of overwhelming grandeur, but because of the sense of harmony. Guests would have noticed the way light moved through the house, how spaces flowed naturally into one another, how comfort and refinement were balanced with ease. The house's importance grew not only from its originality, but from what it represented. At a time when Newport was dominated by the arms race of excess, the Astors battling the Vanderbilts for social dominance, fortunes flaunted in marble and gilt, the Isaac Bell House offered a quiet counterpoint. It was proof that luxury did not have to mean excess, that wealth could express itself in simplicity and elegance. In this way, the house became one of the most influential of its generation, a cornerstone of the shingle style that would shape American domestic architecture for decades to come. As the 20th century unfolded, however, the Isaac Bell House faced the same uncertainties as many Newport mansions. Families moved on, fortunes shifted, and the upkeep of such estates became increasingly difficult. For a time, the house slipped into neglect, its shingles weathered not by intention, but by time. Yet its architectural significance saved it. In 1996, it was acquired by the Preservation Society of Newport County, ensuring that one of America's architectural masterpieces would not vanish. Today, the Isaac Bell House stands restored, a living lesson in what the Gilded Age could have been if more families had chosen restraint over opulence. Visitors walk through its halls and marvel at its balance of simplicity and sophistication. It feels, even now, refreshingly modern, open, airy, comfortable, and deeply tied to its landscape. Unlike the Breakers, which overwhelms with scale, or Marble House, which dazzles with ornament, the Isaac Bell House disarms with grace. Imagine standing on its wide porch on a summer evening in the 1880s. The scent of the sea drifts in on the breeze, mingling with the creak of wooden shingles and the soft chatter of guests. Inside, the glow of lamplight falls on carved wood and quiet details, not gilded ceilings or marble columns. It is luxury, yes, but luxury reimagined, softer, more thoughtful, more attuned to life itself. In Newport, where excess defined an age, the Isaac Bell House remains a rare statement of restraint. It is proof that amid splendor, simplicity can speak just as powerfully, and sometimes more beautifully, than gold or marble ever could. The Elms, French Gardens and American Fortunes. Along Bellevue Avenue, where one Gilded Age palace rises after another, the Elms offers a glimpse of France transplanted to American soil. Unlike the medieval fantasy of Rough Point or the Gothic mood of Vinland, the Elms radiates clarity and order, a deliberate echo of European aristocracy reshaped by American ambition. Its facade, modeled after the Chateau d'Anières outside Paris, announces refinement. But its story, like all Newport mansions, is one of money, power, decline, and improbable survival. The Elms was commissioned in 1898 by Edward Julius Berwind, a coal magnate from Pennsylvania, whose fortune was made in supplying the fuel that powered America's railroads, factories, and households. By the turn of the century, Berwind and his wife Hermione had become fixtures in Newport society, but their summer house needed to reflect more than wealth. It needed to embody culture. To achieve this, they turned to Philadelphia architect Horace Trumbauer, who designed a mansion completed in 1901 that fused old-world elegance with new-world practicality. At first sight, the Elms impresses with symmetry. Its limestone facade rises in measured harmony, each window and balustrade placed with almost mathematical precision. Inside, the house is a study in grandeur. Marble hallways, gilded salons, and ceilings painted with allegorical scenes. But perhaps the most striking feature of the Elms is what lies beyond its walls. Its gardens, among the finest examples of formal landscaping in America at the time. Modeled after 18th century French designs, the gardens were a masterpiece of geometry and spectacle. Terraces extended into sweeping lawns, fountains splashed in sculpted basins, and marble pavilions punctuated the landscape. Rare imported trees and elaborate parterres created a sense of order so precise it felt theatrical. For Berwind, the gardens were not simply decoration. They were a stage, a living canvas upon which his guests could stroll and admire both nature and his fortune. Imagine arriving at the Elms for a summer gathering. Carriages pulled up to the porte cochere, delivering guests into a hall glittering with crystal chandeliers. Dinner might be served on fine French porcelain, while chamber music filled the air. Later guests wandered into the gardens lit by lanterns, the scent of flowers mingling with sea air, fountains sparkling in the moonlight. Unlike the dramatic cliffside excess of the breakers, the Elms exuded an air of aristocratic calm, a carefully orchestrated performance of European refinement in the New World. Berwyn himself was a fascinating figure. Known as one of the most rigid and disciplined of Newport's hosts, he ran his household with the precision of a coal empire. The Elms became a place of rituals, exact dinner times, formal dress, strict adherence to hierarchy. Where Alva Vanderbilt might use her home as a platform for feminist politics, Berwyn used his to stage continuity, order, and control. His reputation for being both exacting and deeply private added an aura of formality to the estate. Yet, as with so many Newport mansions, time eventually caught up with the Elms. Edward Berwyn died in 1936, and Hermione had passed long before. The house passed to his sister Julia, who remarkably continued to live there until 1961, well into her 90s, maintaining the property largely as it had been in its Gilded Age prime. But after her death, the fate of the Elms grew precarious. Without an heir to carry on the tradition, the estate faced the very real threat of demolition. By the early 1960s, many of Newport's great houses were being torn down, victims of skyrocketing maintenance costs and a lack of modern purpose. The Elms, with its vast gardens and intricate interiors, seemed destined for the same fate. Yet here, history took an unexpected turn. The Preservation Society of Newport County, newly energized by the success of saving the breakers and Marble House, launched a campaign to rescue the Elms. Against the odds, they succeeded. In 1962, the Elms was purchased by the Society and preserved as a public museum. This rescue was more than a victory for one house. It marked a turning point in how America viewed its Gilded Age heritage. The Elms became a living classroom, a space where visitors could walk not only through grand halls but also behind the scenes. Unlike many other mansions, the Elms opened its servant quarters and service areas to the public, revealing the hidden machinery of life in a palace. Visitors could trace the paths of maids and butlers, climb the narrow staircases they used, and understand the stark contrasts between the glittering salons and the hard labor that sustained them. Today, the Elms is one of Newport's crown jewels, visited by hundreds of thousands each year. Its gardens have been meticulously restored, fountains flowing again as they did in Berwyn's time. The interiors shine with the same gilded glow that once greeted society's elite, yet now they belong to everyone who walks through. The preservation of the Elms underscores a truth about Newport. Its mansions endure not simply because they were built, but because people chose to save them. Standing on the garden terrace of the Elms now, one sees the same view Berwyn once orchestrated, a tableau of clipped hedges, marble statues, and sea air drifting in from Narragansett Bay. Yet the meaning has shifted. What was once a private theater of wealth is now a public museum of history, reminding us that the fortunes of one age can, if preserved, enrich the imaginations of another. The Elms remains more than a mansion. It is a symbol of both the fragility and resilience of the Gilded Age, a house that nearly vanished but instead endures as a place where French gardens meet American fortunes, and where the past continues to bloom in stone and green. Chateau-sur-Mer, the beginning of Newport's mansion. Before the breakers towered over the cliffs and before Marble House dazzled with gold-leafed ceilings, Newport had Chateau-sur-Mer. Rising in stately grandeur on Bellevue Avenue, it was one of the first true mansions of Newport, a house that announced, long before the Vanderbilts and Astors arrived, that this quiet coastal town could be transformed into a stage for America's wealthiest families. If the breakers was the climax of Newport's Gilded Age story, Chateau-sur-Mer was its overture, the mansion that set the tone for everything that followed. Built in 1852 for William Shepherd Wetmore, a wealthy merchant whose fortune came from the China trade, Chateau-sur-Mer predated the bulk of Newport's mansion boom by decades. At a time when many wealthy New Yorkers still summered in modest cottages, Wetmore commissioned architect Seth Bradford to design a house that would rival European estates. The result was an imposing structure in the Italianate style, with a central tower, bracketed eaves, and brownstone trim that lent the house a continental air. The name, Chateau-sur-Mer, or Castle by the Sea, was no exaggeration. While most Newport homes of the 1850s remained quaint, Wetmore's mansion was a palace. It was here that the first great society balls were held in Newport, long before Alva Vanderbilt staged her famous costume parties. Guests marveled at the scale of the rooms, the elegance of the furnishings, and the expansive grounds landscaped with exotic trees imported from around the world. By the late 19th century, however, tastes had shifted. Italianate had given way to French Renaissance and Beaux-Arts extravagance, and Chateau-sur-Mer found itself in need of transformation. In the 1870s, Wetmore's son, George Peabody Wetmore, who would later serve as a U.S. Senator from Rhode Island, commissioned architect Richard Morris Hunt to remodel the house. Hunt, who would go on to design the Breakers, transformed Chateau-sur-Mer's interiors in the Second Empire style, with elaborate carved woodwork, gilded detailing, and heavy ornamentation that reflected the evolving tastes of America's elite. The remodeled house became a beacon of Newport society in the decades before the Vanderbilts arrived in force. Its grand ballroom hosted some of the city's most important gatherings, including political receptions and society dances. In many ways, Chateau-sur-Mer represented the first act of Newport's transformation, from a seaside town dotted with modest summer homes to a glittering resort dominated by palaces of unimaginable scale. The estate's gardens were equally impressive. Spread over nearly 30 acres, they featured winding carriage paths, greenhouses, and an extraordinary collection of specimen trees, many of which still stand today. These gardens reflected not only wealth, but also an early embrace of the idea that a Newport estate should be a world unto itself, a private kingdom bounded by stone walls and sea breezes. But while Chateau-sur-Mer was once the pinnacle of Newport luxury, by the time the Breakers and Marble House were complete, it seemed almost restrained. The Vanderbilts' marble halls and Alva's gold-drenched salons dwarfed the Wetmore's house in sheer opulence. Yet this contrast only underscores Chateau-sur-Mer's importance. It was the mansion that opened the door, the first true palace that made Newport's transformation possible. Without it, the Vanderbilts might never have chosen Bellevue Avenue for their stage. Like so many Newport houses, Chateau-sur-Mer faced decline in the 20th century. As fortunes shifted and maintaining such vast properties became untenable, the Wetmore heirs struggled to preserve the estate. Eventually, it was acquired by the Preservation Society of Newport County, which restored its interiors and grounds, ensuring that one of the city's foundational mansions would not be lost. Today, it stands as both a museum and a reminder of the dawn of Newport's Gilded Age. Walking through Chateau-sur-Mer today feels different from visiting the Breakers or the Elms. There is a sense of stepping back not only into a gilded world, but into the moment before the deluge, when opulence was still finding its form in Newport. The wood-paneled halls, heavy draperies, and Italianate detailing evoke an earlier style of wealth, grander than the cottages that came before, but not yet as overwhelming as the palaces that followed. Stand on its terrace and you can almost imagine William Wetmore surveying his creation in the 1850s, satisfied that his house by the sea announced his success as loudly as any European chateau. In his decision to build so boldly, he set a precedent that others would soon follow and surpass. Chateau-sur-Mer is thus more than just another Newport mansion. It is the prologue to an era, the house that transformed a fishing village into a playground for millionaires, and the place where America's mansion age truly began. It may have been eclipsed in scale and glitter, but without Chateau-sur-Mer, the story of Newport's Gilded Age palaces could never have been written. Abandoned echoes, Newport's forgotten smaller estates. When most people think of Newport, their minds leap immediately to the Breakers, Marble House, or Rosecliffe, the monumental showpieces of the Gilded Age. These palaces still stand, preserved like gilded time capsules, drawing millions who want to glimpse the opulence of America's wealthiest families. Yet beyond the shining facades of the famous cottages lies another, quieter story. The tale of Newport's forgotten estates, the smaller mansions and summer homes that once dotted the landscape, but have since fallen into ruin or disappeared altogether. Their names are less familiar, their grandeur often erased, but their echoes remain, ghosts of a gilded world that was never meant to last forever. In the mid-19th and early 20th centuries, Newport became a magnet not just for the Vanderbilts and Astors, but for dozens of wealthy families who sought refuge from the heat of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia summers. For every palace on Bellevue Avenue, there were half a dozen more modest estates tucked into side streets, rolling hills, and hidden corners of the coast. These houses might not have boasted 50 rooms or marble imported from Europe, but they reflected their owners' ambitions to belong to Newport's rarefied world. Some of these estates have been reduced to little more than names in the city's records. Edgehill, for example, once stood proudly on Bellevue Avenue before it was demolished in the mid-20th century. The Waves, another forgotten mansion, commanded a view of the ocean but eventually succumbed to fire. Others were quietly dismantled as maintenance costs became overwhelming, their marble fireplaces and carved woodwork sold off to antique dealers or shipped to other homes. One of the most haunting examples is the Reef, also known as the Bells, whose skeletal ruins still stand near Ocean Drive. Once the estate of copper magnate Theodore Davis, it was gutted by fire and later left to decay, its stone arches scrawled with graffiti, its gardens overtaken by weeds. It is a reminder that not all of Newport's Gilded Age wealth could withstand the relentless pressures of time, economics, and indifference. Many of Newport's lesser-known houses were built in styles that reflected their owners' personal tastes rather than the grand ambitions of the Vanderbilts. Shingle-style cottages, colonial revival homes, and smaller Gothic-inspired villas peppered the city's landscape. These homes might have had just a dozen rooms rather than 50, but they still represented extraordinary luxury compared to the average American household of the era. For many wealthy families, owning even a modest estate in Newport was a passport into society's upper tiers, an address that meant belonging. But as the 20th century advanced, Newport's glittering world cracked. The income tax, the Great Depression, and the rising costs of maintaining vast properties proved devastating. While the largest mansions eventually found salvation as museums or universities, the smaller estates were often left with no lifeline. Without the fame or architectural significance of their grander neighbors, they slipped into neglect. Some were abandoned, their roofs collapsing and gardens choked with ivy. Others were sold off in pieces, their land subdivided for development, leaving no trace of the homes that once anchored them. Even so, these forgotten mansions left their imprint on the city. Locals remember stories of grand houses where children once played on lawns that are now parking lots. Old photographs reveal verandas and turrets that no longer exist, faint reminders of a Newport that has vanished. Some of the smaller estates survive only in fragments. A crumbling carriage house, a gatepost hidden in overgrown shrubs, or an ornate fountain marooned in a modern backyard. These remnants, half hidden in plain sight, are like archaeological clues to a world erased. There is a poignancy in their loss. While the Breakers dazzles with its intact grandeur, the smaller abandoned estates tell a different kind of story, a story of impermanence. They remind us that the Gilded Age, for all its wealth and display, was built on fragile foundations. Without careful preservation, even the grandest homes could be reduced to rubble and memory. And yet, in their absence, the forgotten mansions have gained a certain mystique. Urban explorers and local historians seek out their ruins, photographing the decayed arches of the Bells or the lonely gatehouses of vanished estates. For some, these remnants hold more emotional power than the polished museums of Bellevue Avenue. They show the vulnerability behind the wealth, the reality that even marble and stone cannot forever resist the tides of time and neglect. Walking through Newport today, you might pass a quiet street lined with modern houses and never know that a grand estate once stood there. You might cross a field where cows now graze, unaware that a society ball once lit up the night on that very spot. These abandoned echoes remind us that history is not only what survives, but also what is lost. The forgotten estates of Newport may never draw the crowds that the Breakers does, but they form an invisible layer of the city's identity. A shadow world of vanished palaces that once carried the dreams of America's elite. In the end, Newport's forgotten estates are as essential to its story as the grand mansions that still stand. They embody the fleeting nature of wealth, the shifting sands of fortune, and the way beauty can fade when no one remains to protect it. Their ruins whisper that even in a city of palaces, not all could be saved, and sometimes the most powerful stories are those etched in absence. Servants' stories, the invisible workforce of Newport. Behind every glittering chandelier, every perfectly manicured garden, and every lavish banquet of Newport's Gilded Age stood an invisible army. While the Vanderbilts and Astors danced in gold-drenched ballrooms, it was butlers, maids, cooks, footmen, gardeners, and laundresses who kept the grand estates alive. Their work was constant, grueling, and largely unseen, yet without them, the world of Newport's mansions would have collapsed within days. In many ways, these servants lived parallel lives to their employers. The wealthy summered in Newport for leisure, while the staff arrived for labor. Mansions such as the Breakers employed as many as 40 servants during the peak season. Their day began long before their employers woke and ended long after the last guest left a ballroom at 3 a.m. For them, Newport was not a paradise of leisure, but a proving ground of stamina and discipline. A butler, for instance, carried immense responsibility. He oversaw the entire household, managed the wine cellar, trained footmen in precise service rituals, and made sure every meal was served with flawless timing. In a place like the Elms, the butler had to know exactly how many minutes champagne should be chilled, or how silverware was to be aligned to match the expectations of European-trained guests. Every detail mattered, and failure was not an option. Below stairs, cooks and kitchen staff worked in conditions that were as far from glamour as possible. While guests feasted on multi-course French dinners upstairs, the kitchen roared with heat from coal ranges. Dishes had to be prepared in exact sequence, carried up on dumbwaiters, and served at the perfect temperature. Mistakes could mean dismissal. Some cooks were imported from Europe, expected to replicate Parisian standards on the Rhode Island coast. Housemaids formed the backbone of the workforce, responsible for dusting rooms the size of modern apartments, laundering mountains of linens, and polishing endless marble and silver. Their work was exhausting, repetitive, and invisible by design. A well-trained maid ensured her presence was never noticed. Her success was measured in the illusion that rooms always remained spotless without effort. Then there were the gardeners, whose tasks stretched across acres of estate grounds. At the Elms, French-inspired gardens required constant pruning, watering, and care, often under the supervision of European-trained head gardeners. Imagine the pressure of maintaining hedges and fountains to perfection, knowing that a single wilted flower might be noticed by a critical hostess or guest. Most of these servants lived on site in cramped quarters, attics, basements, or small wings tucked out of sight of the main house. Their world was a stark contrast to the opulence they maintained. Narrow hallways, plain iron beds, and shared washrooms defined their living conditions. Yet many accepted this life, as it offered steady wages, housing, and in some cases, the prestige of working for one of the great families. Social hierarchies within the staff were as rigid as those upstairs. The butler outranked the footmen, the housekeeper commanded the maids, and the chef ruled the kitchen like a general. Servants navigated their own world of promotions, rivalries, and alliances, often forming bonds with each other stronger than those they had with their employers. For many, the work was seasonal. Families often retreated to Newport in June and left by September, meaning servants might follow them between city residences, country estates, and yachts. This itinerant lifestyle demanded adaptability. A footman could find himself serving champagne in Newport one week and unpacking trunks in New York the next. Yet, amid the hierarchy and hard labor, there were moments of humanity. Servants often knew more about their employers than the employers knew about themselves. They overheard secrets whispered in drawing rooms, saw quarrels behind closed doors, and knew the quirks and temperaments of the wealthy better than any guest did. Some became confidants. Others bore silent witness to scandals that newspapers could only speculate about. The Gilded Age elite may have been the public face of Newport, but the servants were its lifeblood. Without them, the grand houses would have been hollow shells, and though their names rarely appeared in society columns, they formed the hidden foundation of the era's spectacle. Today, when visitors tour the Elms or Marble House, some preservation groups make a point of showing not only the ballrooms, but also the servants' quarters and passageways. These spaces tell the other half of Newport's story, a tale not of leisure and luxury, but of labor and sacrifice. It's a reminder that every sparkling chandelier was polished by hand, every elaborate feast prepared in stifling kitchens, every gown brushed and laid out by someone whose name history too often forgot. In many ways, the servants' world was a mirror image of the Gilded Age itself, dazzling on the surface, grueling beneath. Their stories may not glitter like the gold leaf ceilings of the breakers, but they are essential to understanding what Newport truly was. A place where two worlds coexisted, one upstairs and one downstairs, both bound together in the fragile performance of wealth. Scandal, gossip, and ghosts, Newport's darker tales. Newport in the Gilded Age was a place of dazzling facades, glittering marble halls, grand staircases, and endless summer balls where the nation's richest families displayed their power. But behind the chandeliers and champagne lurked another world, one filled with whispered scandals, tabloid gossip, and even ghostly legends. For all its brilliance, Newport was also a stage for shadows. In the late 19th century, newspapers loved to publish stories about the summer exploits of the elite. Every ball, every carriage ride, every wardrobe choice of Alva Vanderbilt or Caroline Astor was fodder for the press. The public could not get enough of the spectacle, but gossip often cut deeper than compliments. Rumors of affairs, financial ruin, or social snubs spread like wildfire through Newport's drawing rooms. The Gilded Age may have had no social media, but its newspapers and word-of-mouth networks created their own celebrity culture, and the mansions of Bellevue Avenue were the tabloid's favorite backdrop. Consider the scandal surrounding Alva Vanderbilt's famous costume ball of 1883 at Marble House. Guests came dressed as queens, knights, and mythological figures in gowns and armor worth thousands of dollars. The party cemented the Vanderbilts' rise into high society, but it also sparked whispers. Critics muttered about excess bordering on vulgarity, while others speculated about the real motives behind the Vanderbilts' theatrical displays: power, recognition, and a need to outshine rivals like the Astors. Other scandals were more personal. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, master of the breakers, faced rumors of ruthless business practices. Guests might have marveled at the mosaics in his dining room, but beyond the walls, laborers in his railroad empire suffered under harsh conditions. The gossip surrounding the Vanderbilts was not just about fashion. It was about morality, about whether fortunes built on monopolies could ever truly buy legitimacy. Then there were tales of affairs and clandestine romances. Newport's summer season was short, but it burned hot, filled with long evenings, chance encounters in gardens, and too much champagne. Whispers of liaisons between married socialites circulated in hushed tones, carefully avoided in the newspapers, but eagerly traded among the servants who observed everything. The idea that behind every perfect marriage portrait there might be a secret was part of Newport's allure. But beyond the gossip of the living, Newport cultivated its share of ghost stories. Mansions that stood half empty for most of the year were fertile ground for tales of hauntings. Seaview Terrace, the Kerry mansion, with its Gothic arches and dark hallways, became famous as a filming location for the television series Dark Shadows. But even before Hollywood arrived, locals whispered of strange sounds and figures moving through its halls. Rough Point, the home of Doris Duke, carried perhaps the darkest tale of all. In 1966, her designer and close companion Eduardo Torella was killed in a car accident at the estate's gates under circumstances that many have continued to question. Though it was officially deemed an accident, rumors of intentional foul play clung to Rough Point, cementing its reputation as one of Newport's most scandal-haunted estates. Even Belcourt Castle picked up a reputation for the supernatural after it was converted into a museum of oddities in the mid-20th century. Visitors spoke of strange sensations in the ballroom, cold spots in the corridors, and antique armor that seemed to carry its own restless energy. Whether or not one believed in ghosts, these stories fed the sense that Newport's mansions were more than stone and marble. They were vessels of memory and sometimes of unfinished business. Scandals also touched the boundaries of class. While high society lived in splendor, Newport's working-class neighborhoods buzzed with resentment. Servants who labored in kitchens and stables carried home stories about their employers. Sometimes these stories became gossip in their own communities, tales of drunken tantrums, family feuds, or whispered cruelty. Newport was a small town beneath the glitter, and secrets had a way of traveling quickly. In the 20th century, when many of the great houses fell into decline, the aura of scandal and haunting only deepened. Abandoned estates like the Bells became playgrounds for teenagers who carved graffiti into their walls and dared one another to wander its ruins at night. The eerie silence of empty ballrooms, once filled with laughter and music, became the perfect setting for ghost stories passed down through generations. What is striking is how these darker tales complete Newport's image. The Gilded Age was never just about wealth and beauty. It was also about ambition, envy, excess, and the human flaws hidden beneath layers of silk and gold leaf. The gossip columns, the whispered scandals, and the haunted corridors remind us that the people who built Newport's mansions were not untouchable gods, but human beings, prone to mistakes, passions, and secrets. To walk Newport's Cliff Walk today is to pass by these palaces of stone and wonder at what lies within. The grand facades remain intact, but if walls could talk, they would tell not only of elegance but also of betrayals, heartbreaks, and restless ghosts. The darker side of Newport, the scandals, gossip, and hauntings, still lingers in the air, as much a part of its story as the glittering chandeliers, preservation battles, saving the mansions from oblivion. By the middle of the 20th century, Newport's glittering mansions, the palaces that once embodied the triumph of America's Gilded Age, were not symbols of permanence. They were fragile, oversized burdens. Families had dwindled, fortunes had evaporated, and maintenance on a 50-room cottage with acres of formal gardens became more curse than blessing. The marble halls that once hosted Vanderbilts, Astors, and Berwins were falling into disrepair, their roofs leaking, their chandeliers covered in dust. Some were shuttered, others sold for a fraction of their worth, and still others demolished outright. By the 1950s, it looked as if Newport's architectural crown jewels might vanish forever. The threat was real. Shady Leah and Ochre Lodge disappeared. Other estates were subdivided, their sprawling lawns sold for development. Even some of the most famous houses were considered liabilities rather than treasures. Marble House, the Elms, and the Breakers, today cornerstones of Newport's identity, were once seen as white elephants, too costly to heat or repair, too out of step with modern living. For their owners, the Gilded Age had ended long ago, and these mansions were relics of a time few wanted to preserve. The turning point came in 1945, with the founding of the Preservation Society of Newport County, initially established by a group of local residents determined to save Hunter House, an 18th century colonial mansion. Their success revealed something powerful. Newport's architectural heritage had a value that went beyond family fortunes. It could become part of the community's identity, and eventually, its economy. What began as a small group of preservationists soon evolved into a movement to rescue the entire Gilded Age legacy. The first great test came with the Elms in 1962. After Julia Berwin's death, the estate was threatened with auction and likely demolition. For $116,000, an astonishingly modest sum even then, the Preservation Society stepped in, buying the mansion and opening it to the public. Visitors flocked to see the grandeur of Newport's past, and suddenly the idea that these houses could sustain themselves as museums took hold. From there, the preservation battles unfolded like a campaign. Marble House, abandoned for years, was restored and opened in 1963. The Breakers, the ultimate Vanderbilt estate, followed soon after, its 70 rooms becoming the Society's most famous and profitable property. Each house required enormous investment, roofs repaired, marble polished, gardens replanted. But the gamble paid off. Tourism surged, and Newport's identity transformed from a fading summer colony into a living museum of the Gilded Age. The Preservation Society was not alone in these efforts. Wealthy benefactors and private fortunes played crucial roles. Philanthropists like Doris Duke, through her Newport Restoration Foundation, purchased and restored dozens of smaller historic houses in Newport, ensuring that the city's charm extended beyond the mansions. Without her intervention, entire streets of colonial and Victorian homes might have vanished under the wrecking ball of mid-century development. Saving these houses was never easy. Preservationists often faced skepticism, financial shortfalls, and even hostility from developers who saw the sprawling estates as prime land for subdivision. Maintenance costs remained astronomical. Roofs leaked, boilers failed, plaster cracked, and every restoration seemed to uncover another hidden crisis. Each victory felt temporary, requiring constant vigilance to ensure the houses did not slide back into decay. Yet over time, the preservation battles reshaped how Americans viewed the Gilded Age. What was once dismissed as vulgar excess came to be appreciated as architectural artistry and cultural heritage. Visitors who might have scoffed at the Vanderbilt's vanity found themselves awed by the craftsmanship of carved woodwork, the engineering of marble staircases, the beauty of French-inspired gardens. Preservation gave Newport's mansions a second life, not as private playgrounds for the elite, but as shared monuments of history. Today, the results of those battles are clear. The Breakers draws hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, its ticket sales funding the continued survival of Newport's other great estates. Marble House, Rosecliffe, and the Elms sparkle as if the Gilded Age never ended. Their ballrooms hosting everything from tours to weddings to film sets. Even lesser-known houses like Chateau-sur-Mer and Isaac Bell House stand proudly preserved, teaching visitors that Newport's story is not just about excess, but about architecture, innovation, and the passage of time. And yet, preservation remains an ongoing fight. Sea level rise threatens the cliff walk, storms batter the stone walls of seaside estates, and the sheer cost of maintaining these colossal structures never diminishes. Each winter brings new repairs, new fundraising campaigns, and new debates over how best to balance access with protection. The gilded surfaces must constantly be renewed, lest they slip back into ruin. But the fact that these houses still stand at all is testament to the vision of those who fought for them. Without the Preservation Society, without private donors, and without the recognition that history itself can be an inheritance worth saving, Newport might today be lined with luxury condos rather than marble palaces. The preservation battles remind us that the Gilded Age was never just about the families who built these mansions. It is also about the generations who chose to keep them alive. Each restored window pane, each polished banister, each replanted garden represents not just the past, but a choice for the future, to remember, to value, and to protect. The mansions of Newport are no longer fragile relics at the edge of demolition. They are resilient survivors, standing as living monuments to an age of ambition, folly, beauty, and preservation against all odds. From Gilded Age to Tourist Age, Newport today. Walk down Bellevue Avenue on a summer afternoon and you'll hear the hum of a new kind of society, not the clink of crystal champagne flutes or the rustle of silk gowns, but the shuffle of sneakers, the chatter of guided tours, and the clicking of cameras. Newport's mansions, once fortresses of exclusivity, are now open doors. What was built as a playground for the richest families in America has become one of the busiest tourist destinations in New England. A place where the ghosts of the Gilded Age share space with busloads of visitors, wedding parties, and curious locals rediscovering their own heritage. The transformation did not happen overnight. By the mid-20th century, Newport's estates teetered between two futures: oblivion or rebirth. Demolition claimed more than a few of the city's smaller mansions, while others stood shuttered, deteriorating under salty winds and neglect. But thanks to the tireless work of preservationists, philanthropists, and a growing fascination with America's gilded past, Newport's identity shifted from a fading enclave of the elite to a showcase of national history. Today, that gamble has paid off. More than 1 million people visit Newport's historic houses each year, making them central not just to Rhode Island's culture, but to its economy. Each mansion now plays a role in this modern reinvention. The Breakers, once Cornelius Vanderbilt II's fortress of excess, is now the most visited historic house in New England. It draws lines of tourists who marvel at its 70 rooms of mosaics, marble, and gilding, pausing to imagine what it must have been like to dine at a 12-foot-long table under crystal chandeliers. Marble House welcomes visitors not only with its Versailles-inspired salons, but also with exhibits about Alva Vanderbilt's unexpected role in the women's suffrage movement. Rosecliffe, once the site of extravagant costume balls, now hosts weddings and film crews, its ballroom forever linked to the Great Gatsby. Even houses that never rivaled the Breakers in scale have found new lives. Isaac Bell House, with its shingle-style simplicity, is celebrated as a landmark of American architecture. Ochre Court, once the domain of the ULA family, is now part of Salve Regina University, its halls echoing with students rather than orchestras. Rough Point, preserved as Doris Duke left it, feels more intimate than grandiose, giving visitors the sense of stepping directly into the life of one of the 20th century's most eccentric heiresses. But Newport's reinvention as a tourist destination is not just about houses. It is about the way these mansions have become symbols of Rhode Island itself. In a state often overshadowed by its larger neighbors, Newport has become a brand, a shorthand for American luxury, history, and spectacle. Postcards, magazines, and social media feeds are filled with images of marble staircases and oceanfront lawns. For Rhode Island, the mansions are not only relics of the past, they are engines of the present, drawing millions of dollars each year in tourism revenue. Yet, the tourist age has also reshaped the way people experience these homes. Where once the ballrooms echoed with exclusive parties, they now host fundraising galas or community events. Where once servants' staircases carried trays of champagne, they now carry tour groups learning about the realities of Gilded Age labor. Preservation has not just saved the mansions, it has reframed them. They are no longer monuments to inequality alone, but teaching tools, places where visitors can reflect on both the beauty and the contradictions of America's gilded past. The mansions also anchor Newport's cultural calendar. Summer music festivals, lectures, and art exhibits use these estates as stages, blending historic grandeur with contemporary creativity. For example, the Elms gardens are now as much a backdrop for photography as for horticultural admiration, while Belcourt Castle, long a curiosity, has found new interest as a space for weddings and private events. Even the ruins, like the Bells, attract curiosity seekers, urban explorers, and artists who find inspiration in decay as much as in opulence. Of course, tourism brings challenges. Balancing preservation with accessibility is a constant struggle. Foot traffic wears on delicate flooring. Climate control systems strain to protect fragile art, and the constant flow of visitors risks reducing spaces of history to backdrops for selfies. Preservationists often describe their work as a tightrope walk, keeping the houses alive for the public without allowing that very public to erode them. Rising sea levels and Atlantic storms add another layer of urgency, as Newport's seaside location makes many of its treasures vulnerable to climate change. And yet the tourist age has given Newport something the Gilded Age never did: openness. What was once the exclusive domain of a few hundred families is now accessible to millions. A school teacher from Kansas, a family from Brazil, or a student from Boston can walk the same halls as the Vanderbilts and Astors, seeing firsthand what gilded wealth looked like and reflecting on what it meant. In a way, this democratization is its own kind of justice, reclaiming the mansions not just as relics of privilege but as shared cultural heritage. To walk the cliff walk today is to see both stories at once: the grandeur of marble palaces gleaming under the sun and the steady flow of visitors who bring new life to them each day. Newport has moved from being the capital of summer society to the capital of Gilded Age memory, a place where past and present meet on every street corner. In the end, Newport today is not only about preservation, but about reinvention. Its mansions no longer represent just the power of the few, but the curiosity of the many. They have survived fire, neglect, and even the wrecking ball, and in doing so, they have become something their builders never imagined. Not private symbols of status, but public symbols of history. Newport's tourist age ensures that the voices of the past, whether whispered in scandal, shouted in parties, or echoed in empty ruins, will continue to be heard by generations to come.